Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all, and thank you so much for making time to be part of this very interesting discussion or conversation that we're having this afternoon. My name is Victor Sibeko. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Relations Institute of Southern Africa, past president of PRISA. I'm an independent consultant. I'm, a, fir- I refer to myself as the servant of the Most High. But when it comes to public relations and communication management issues, I'm a die-hard supporter and I subscribe to the best practice in the industry. We are joined today by the esteemed guests, Madame Tessa Dooms. Thank you so much for making your time, making time to be with us. And also joined by a young man that I admire so much, Crispin. So we've got Madam Tessa, who is a political analyst, and then we've got Crispin, who is a spokesperson from the Ministry of Justice and Correctional Services. And we are embraced or graced by the presence of Mr. Lorato Nchekeng, the Chief Executive Officer of Decode Communication. Before we get started, just a few ground rules we all know. I know I may be preaching to the converted, that please let's keep our microphones muted. If you'd like to ask a question, there is a little thing that you can press there, raise your hand. If not, you can just badge in, and when you ask a question, tell us your name, where you're from, and then you go straight to your question. Other than that, if you want to make a comment, there is a chat functionality provided on this platform where you can just drop in your comment or your question in this regard. We are discussing something very interesting in the wake of what has been called the fourth industrial revolution, which we've been stuck in for a long time. I think we're almost sailing towards the fifth industrial revolution now. We're talking about something very interesting, which is a special project that Mr. Nchekeng holds very dearly, on the leaders of government on Twitter report. Um, we know Twitter is a social media platform that we use. A lot of us have drifted from various platforms on social media, ended up on Twitter, and Twitter seemed to be one of those effective ones that is used by a lot of users, be it government, be it corporate, be it for social purposes. For the sake of this exercise or this webinar and just an opening, I was very impressed when I looked at Arthur Goldstock report, where he gave statistics of the use of Twitter. I would like to take it several years back. 2016, we had 7.7 million Twitter users. And in a year's time, 2017, we were on 8 million. Currently, we quite a lot of people who are using Twitter. And this was followed by LinkedIn, which is a professional platform for communication, at 5.5 million, 2017, 6.1 million. And then we have Instagram, which is coming up very fast, mostly used for images, which was at 3.5 million, now 3.8 million. When you look at the stats and you look at how the growth, it almost over a year, it shoots up over 1 million users at a time, which prove that this is one of the most effective way of communication. So what has happened here is that the Decode Communication has put together a report, and it launched the South African Leaders of Government on Twitter report. And this was a benchmark tool with the purpose of reflecting on the presence and activity of leaders and their spokesperson on the platform. Okay? Although the report is purely quantitative, it highlights findings and made a number of recommendations on ways to improve citizen engagement and information sharing by government leaders in particular. Now, our panelists are both users of the platform Twitter. They're also consumers of the platform Twitter. Now, what we would like to pick up from this conversation is the effectiveness of the Twitter in your line of duty. But to take us through and lay the foundation on this particular topic, I would like to ask Mr. Lorato Nchekeng to just weigh in and give us an overview of this SA Leaders Government on Twitter report, which you presented one last year. We would like to see what has been the change, especially in 2021, in the advent of COVID-19 and everybody working from home, and not provision, not much provision made for contact sessions. Over to you, Mr. Lorato. As you start, please just briefly tell us who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sibeko. It's quite an honor, one, to gather around with fellow communicators and who are professionals, who are always doing amazing work in their respective fields, and most importantly, with our guests and panelists in Tessa, who's also a communicator herself, working with the COVID comms team as they are trying to help us navigate the public health crisis as we're experiencing it. And before I start with the introduction, I see Luzuko from the chat has asked if there is a hashtag for this webinar. We didn't really have one, but Luzuko, I guess we can hashtag GovCommsSocial, GovCommS social, hashtag GovCommsSocial. And I have been in communications for the past 17 years now. That is Sibeko. Started in South African Airways in operations communications, went up to head the internal communications division, and eventually was part of the corporate comms at SAA before I joined consultancy, where I worked a little bit until I tried my hand at political communications, where in 2009, as part of the work that I was doing and as part of just being part of the practice, I was recognized as the Mail and Guardian, one of the top 200 young South Africans, particularly in my domain of communication strategy development in particular. And in 2012, I then decided to become brave and start my own PR agency, which is Decode. So we've been up and running for the past 9 years so far. And as you can imagine, with my background from South African Airways, even when I joined consultancy, almost unintentionally so, I gravitated towards public sector clients, right? So even my portfolio, when I was in consultancy, I was doing a lot of work for public sector clients. So generally, although throughout my career, we've done a lot of work as Decode with a number of private clients, the domain of the public sector remains that big. And thus, it continues to be an area of interest both from my side as a citizen and somebody who wants to see my fellow communicators in the public sector doing exceptionally well, because as a community, there's nothing that is bigger than seeing your fellow communicators and fellow professionals doing exceptionally well. And then on the other side, really as a citizen, because I am a consumer of government services, right? Whether it's electricity or water services here, or potholes or any other. And throughout my experiences, one of my bugbears is always how there seem to be some gaps in how government communicates at different levels, right? But fortunately, because I have many friends and acquaintances within this space, I then have the opportunity to sometimes not, go on Twitter and complain and all of that. I would go on the side, share them with them, some those complaints. And over time, I then realized that perhaps there was an important thing of how about if we were to, put together some tool that is going to, one, be able to help us put some sort of a mirror, right, where communicators themselves, because a lot of them, while they're doing phenomenal work, there are many who are not, right? And that's really the reality, right? But nothing gets people sitting up to, one, pay attention to the gaps, two, now looking at benchmarks, because once you are being compared to somebody else that is your peer, that is almost in the same space, it becomes easier for you to either go to them and say, what are the lessons learned? Where can I improve, and all of that. So this report really, we decided to put it together last year as as the first one, and again, because COVID, and as I go through one of the slides, we'll see the dramatic shift in terms of internet consumption by South Africans in particular, that showed that communication is shifting, right? It is not shifting from a message perspective. It is not shifting from a tactic perspective, but it is shifting how instantaneous it is becoming. And a lot of what then needs to happen is that, like all of us, government communicators then have a responsibility to catch on. And the question that follows that is Beko, may be, while there's this report, why focus on the leaders, right? And we focus on the leaders precisely because, like with anything, leadership is key, right? Leadership is key in the sense that when there is buy-in from the leadership, there are many things that you are able to unlock, whether it's a matter of budget, whether it's a matter of making key decisions on whether to employ or create capacity around the particular function. It's easier to navigate. And sometimes it's even something as complex as policy, right? Policy on how do we govern this space of social media as a government communicator. And it's very important as well to acknowledge that GCI, the government, the GCIS has the social media policy, right, which is widely circulated and is publicly available. Whether it has to be improved or not, it's a different conversation altogether. And I believe that it needs to be improved because as things move and shift and change, there's that evolution that is required. So the parameters, and I think this is a very important parameter to share. One is that the report, as you've indicated, that is purely quantitative, right? We really didn't look into the depth of messages of the government leaders. We didn't look into their share of voice. We really didn't compare share of voice between ministers, between respective provincial executive council members, as in MECs and premiers. And the other thing is that because we had set up the first one last year, we then compare. We decided that it is good to compare a 12-month period, and the data that was collated in the last report has been as far back as the 12th of December this year, compared to 21 December in the previous year, which is 2020. Of course, social media does not exist in a vacuum, right? It exists, or at least a lot of the conversations and what happens, or what happens to be the things that get us talking the most are events of national significance and all of that. And this is the one year that some of us may want to forget because of high unemployment rates that have been reported. A lot of people have lost their livelihood as a result of the July unrest, etc. And these events were key talking points that got a lot of us, either one, observing how, for instance, the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal and his team were communicating around just managing the whole crisis, or even the Department of Health itself managing the issue around the digital vibes crisis. And a lot of us, over and above, depending on the news, on the news websites, on the newspapers and the TV and traditional radio, we were depending a lot on these leaders to help us communicate. I'd like to draw everyone's attention to this slide in particular, right? So if you look at October 2020 last year, we in terms of page views, when you're looking at online behavior, we're sitting just at over, a billion, around a billion page views in general in South Africa, right? Compare it to this year, the same time, there was a 20% growth. And this growth is really as a result of, because if you compare what was happening at the time in October last year, the economy was starting to open a little bit. I think we're at lockdown level 3 at the time. A lot more people were now starting to go back to the office, and there was starting to be a lot of activity. So this growth again, in terms of internet usage, it also shows on, or at least talks to how we have adopted this remote working, remote, accessing a whole lot of things remotely, including consumption of news and the likes, right? These are just some of the interesting insights that we just thought that they are important to share, because a lot of social media, or at least as far as consumption is concerned, a majority of the social media users say that over and above using it for entertainment and keeping track with what their friends are doing, they use it to consume news, right? So even news sites as well, they have indicated that a lot of traffic comes via social media and not necessarily directly through. So these numbers are not necessarily surprising in terms of the numbers. And again, we will share an email address where all our guests can access the report for download. These are some of the apps. And you started with highlighting the social media use, that is in terms of over the years, how the numbers have grown. Interestingly, the same as Goldstack and the team at Onicore this year reported Facebook to be having at around 27 million users, right? Of course, then the team would be in here, the guest here would be asking, but Lorato, if Facebook has almost close to 3 times the number of users versus Twitter, why pick Twitter versus Facebook, right? And it was very deliberate. We picked Twitter because of a number of reasons, right? The intention is to really intersect how it functions. Twitter functions more as a newsy platform where a lot of the timeline moves a lot faster. But the other observation has been that a lot of journalists are more on Twitter than they are on Facebook, right? Or rather, they even utilize Facebook differently than they use Twitter, and hence really the interest, or why we decided to focus on Twitter and not on Facebook. Are we intending to cover other platforms at a later stage? Of course, capacity and timing dependent, we should be able to do that, right? And some of the interesting things that we've picked up, and this anecdote may have come up a lot this year after the local government elections, right? There has been this retort where people are talking about, if Twitter was real life, the EFF would have won the election. Because if you look at the sentiment on Twitter, seemingly, and this is all anecdotal, seemingly the EFF is doing well in that regard. If you were to pay attention to how well they are using Twitter to communicate their messages consistently, the claim is that EFF would have won the election, right? And there seems to be a sentiment that Twitter is not representative of people on the ground. Of course, with only about 9.7 million active users, this is close to 60 million South Africans. That is relatively small. But if we consider that it is a space where it's influencers and opinion informers, and that is very, very key to be thinking about. Opinion informing and agenda setting, which in our space, public relations and communications and marketing, plays a role. I've spoken a little bit to why leaders, or why we focused on leaders. But I want to look at 2 or 3 most important things. The first one is that with the President Cyril Ramaphosa becoming our president in 2018, and again inaugurated back in 2019, there was a major shift in how they did communications in that office, right? The first one was that never before was there an office of or a function of digital communication. That function was set up, and a certain young lady, brilliant, or she's doing well in my view, Ati Geleba, who then took responsibility of that function, right? And so if you look at what that means from an institutionalization point of view, that is very significant. The question then that we ask is that if we were to look at offices of premiers, do you find the same? And that is significant in the sense that and we know as practitioners and communicators that you need people in those positions to be at the highest level of decision making, so that they can help think about the communication implications. And for me, it was quite significant that that office was set up. Should there be, should all the other members of executive councils in provinces do the same? In my view, they should do that, because if you consider you have ministerial liaison officers who are at that level, they may not necessarily be sitting in every meeting as far as how the offices of ministers, cabinet ministers, and MECs function, but they are very close to decision making. They are very close to being consulted when key communication decisions are being made, and that is very important in my view. The point 5, which is the other one that I want to raise, and we've seen it recently with Minister Fikile Mbalula's outburst, right? Where a certain Carl House puts up a tweet, and I guess Minister Fikile Mbalula did not take kindly to what he put up, and the response was to say the least uncouth from the minister, right? But the question, the biggest question would be, who does he account to? Who would be the person that should be reprimanding Minister Fikile Mbalula, or at least are there guidelines that talk to how Minister Fikile Mbalula, as a public representative, as a minister and a member of the executive council of President Ramaphosa, should be conducting himself in the public platform, particularly as far as engagement is concerned? The lines are blurry there. Is it the president who should do that? Is it parliament? And it's something that I'm hoping that we'll have a conversation about in this conversation. So as far as the findings, and it was quite interesting that, again, this year, this is the first time the President Cyril Ramaphosa went and reshuffled his cabinet. Four ministers where who are no longer in their current portfolios, and that affected our numbers in some way, right? And I'm saying in some way in the sense that, for instance, Minister Tito Mboweni, we all know him, he's a very active Twitter participant. He may have been active, not necessarily on government programs in particular, but be that as it may, he was exceptionally active. And the other ones that came on, Minister Enoch Godongwana, so the new ministers, Minister Enoch Godongwana, Minister Thandi Modise, Minister Mondli Gungubele, and Minister Joe Phaahla, they are all not on Twitter. And that is why you then see that the shift in the number, where this year only 67%, at least a representative number of them, versus it was in 2020. Of course, the one omission, or the one minister that, in my view, it actually bothers me that he's not on Twitter, and it would actually help exceptionally so, because his department is public facing, is the Minister of Police, right? And it's not even about him being on Twitter by himself, and that is why the issue around leadership, because then the importance is about creating capacity to manage his profile, manage his communication, so that he's able to respond quickly to certain things, put out a lot of information as and when. The interesting developments, or at least as far as the findings, when we're comparing the two periods, Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, she has also moved portfolios. Before she was the Minister of Small Business, she's now Minister of Communications and Technologies. She grew the most in terms of following over the period, and followed by Minister Roland Lamola. And I'd like to stop a little bit around Minister Roland Lamola. So the one of the findings has been that amongst all the ministers, their spokespeople, as in the ministerial liaison officers and the department, the Department of Justice and Correctional Services, and we did not even approach Crispin because of this factor, but the observation has been that they have been the most active in terms of communicating, engaging, and being responsive. Because if you consider, for instance, if you are just to juxtapose now, there's the road safety campaign that is happening. Minister Fikile Mbalula's Twitter account is proactively projecting, putting out those key messages. But if you look at the level of engagement, it is very low in terms of how, when people ask questions, people make comments, the minister responds very little, or his account responds very little to those. This is the Department of Correctional of Justice, which also there's a separate account for Department of Correctional Services, right? They have been exceptionally responsive. So it is not surprising to see that the minister has had this kind of growth. Of course, many other activities, including the Section 25 bill, that was now in Parliament recently. So a number of those activities really got them to or at least got that kind of activity. The interesting observation was Minister Patricia de Lille, right? You would anticipate that as somebody who is the leader of a political party in the Independent Democrats, in an election year, there would have been significant growth. But the observation has been that seemingly the political machinery on her part was doing a lot more of the work, and she really did not use her Twitter account to propagate a lot of the political party messaging. And I guess hence that is why it's a little bit different. But of course, even the growth at the time was as a result of her move from the one party DA into sorry, not the Independent Democrats, the Good Party, into starting the Good Party. While the 4 new cabinet ministers are not on Twitter, we celebrate that Minister Senzo Mchunu joined Twitter this year, and his Twitter account is growing steadily, and it's a very good thing that is happening there. It's also interesting. It's also good that he's in a portfolio that we know that is riddled with a number of crises, the water and sanitation. Therefore, it would be good that he uses Twitter to inform a lot of us. I've spoken about the growth, the phenomenal growth there, with the justice and correctional services. So now this I'll just run through. Minister Fikile Mbalula continues to be at the top, followed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, and Gwede Mantashe. What is most interesting about Minister Gwede Mantashe is that he seems to get a lot of activity whenever he's communicating on ANC work and not necessarily on departmental work. And that is why even we're observing that even the growth there was not almost as big as you would see with the president, or even to a certain extent with Minister Ronald Lamola. The other interesting activity was with the deputy president, right? The deputy president doing phenomenally well. Whenever there's either an engagement with SANAC, the team seem to be using the platform exceptionally well. Of course, when he got ill and he had to go to Russia with the treatment, and some disappearance from time to time, or at least as far as the public is concerned, there seems to be a lot of engagement around there. With regards to the department, no surprise there, the presidency is doing phenomenally well. But what is interesting about the president and the presidency is that, one, they do not follow a lot of accounts, right? Two, they do not engage. Three, they don't seem to be interested in interaction. So a lot of the information is more about one way pushing information to citizens, telling us and not necessarily engaging. And that is a weakness there. And we're hoping that that is something that that may be resolved. Of course, most importantly, Department of Health, in the year of the managing the public health crisis, it's very important for them to be there, and they've been doing somewhat well despite the digital vibes issues and the likes. And then the troublesome area, and this is where now with my fellow communicator, right? Ms. Maschaba Ndlovu doing exceptionally well there in terms of the number. But if you look at the activity, again, a lot of it is not departmental, or at least the information and programs of government in particular. They are in ebbs and flows. And it's something that can be done better there. The two most notable people that are really doing well as far as communicating or engaging on their departmental work is Miss Leranzo Themba at South African Police Services, right? Whether you agree with some of the content or not, it's a different matter. But what has been very good about her is that she has been exceptionally consistent in communicating the work that SAPS do. Whenever there's a campaign that they run, whether it's 16 days of activism, there has been a lot of consistency. Whenever the minister is doing roadshows, or whether he's at the South African Human Rights Commission giving testimony on the Phoenix massacre, she is always there giving us up to the minute kind of a reportage. And one of the other good things about Ms. Leranzo Themba, an observation, is that she engages back, right? Even when she gets hit about, there's criticism about this, that, or the other. The one example was the two young girls who were said to, in quotes, abducted by the members of the South African Police Services in Krugersdorp, right? A lot of the people tagged her and SAPS and the SAPS account. Interestingly, because of her responsiveness, Ms. Leranzo Themba was a lot more responsive and quicker on the mark than the SAPS account. And you want it to be the other way around, because when you institutionalize communication, then it then means that there are more hands with a lot more information quicker doing the work. But what she's doing there is exceptionally commendable. Of course, followed by Crispin, who's also doing a lot of work in terms of being responsive on the kind of departmental work, and Sengi as well, Ms. Shabanati Magoda at tourism. I would like for her to see her doing a lot more, but it will be interesting, of course, as time goes on. The saddest thing about this picture is that if you look at the top three, for instance, right, they have about 505,000 followers, 60,000 followers, and 42,000. And the next one immediately after that has only 5,000 followers. What is interesting is that some of the communicators here, one, are ex-journalists. Two, they used to be active on Twitter before they joined from being journalists to being communicators. And for some reason, they then stopped using the platform. And Hlengi is one of those. And the question really, and this is something that is the subject for this conversation, is why is that? But also, what is the missed opportunity when they don't do that? With the provincial cabinet, Minister Panyaza Lesufi, of course, he's known to being an activist minister, but of course this year it became the spotlight was on him with the reported or alleged PPE corruption issue, or not PPE, the fumigation of schools in the tunes of millions of rands. And of course, the advantage as well is that as somebody who, from a social perspective, as the owner or part owner of a PSL club, Moroka Swallows, so he engages a lot. And even on other issues of national interest, issues that when it comes to racism, that comes to Afrikanerdom or any other. So he engages a lot, and that is why if you even look at how well he is doing, there seems to be that kind of a good activity there, right? The two most interesting increases there was the Premier Sihle Zikalala and his MEC Kwazim Shengu. There definitely was some interest. I suspect one as a result of the unrest in the unrest in KwaZulu Natal, but also that they are really taking to Twitter better than many others. The findings there, of course, we've spoken a little bit about Minister Panyaza Lesufi and Kwazim Shengu. In 2020, only two premiers were not on Twitter last year. This year it is three, because in the Northwest we know that former Premier Job Mokgoro vacated his office, and now with Premier Bushimape, who is not on Twitter, it is anyone's guess to see whether he will be joining the fold. And this is the last slide. These are the very important noteworthy observations, right? The first one, very, very important, right? It is worrisome that Minister Mbalula's engagement in total is not as a result of his bio. So if you're just to read his bio, you will assume that this somebody, as the Minister of Transport, ought to be communicating a lot and engaging around a lot on transport. But when you look at the engagement, it is not the case. Is it something that needs to be fixed, particularly around how he behaves as a leader? There's a certain expectation from leaders to behave themselves in a certain way, and unfortunately, Minister Mbalula does not seem to be the model leader. But most importantly, I suspect that he creates a very difficult position for his communicators. If you are his communicator and now you have to deal with the kind of response that he responded to Carl Niehaus, it creates an unnecessary crisis. The other observation is that we've seen the spokesperson of cabinet, and we have not covered her as one of the chief spokespersons here, because she's not necessarily attached to a minister or an executive member, Mephumla Williams. It was good to see that her following also increased by 50%, which is something good. Can she do better? Of course. Are we seeing less of her? Of course. Should we be seeing more of her? Of course. And I've spoken a little bit about Ms. Atigeleba, who's probably the one of the most visible government communicators, following increasing by more than 50%, which is exceptionally well, because it augurs well in terms of this kind of visibility. And lastly, really is that it is worrisome that in the era of misinformation, disinformation, or what we also refer to as fake news, we are not seeing all government or all cabinet members, both at national and in provincial cabinet, verifying their accounts. Right? It is important for communicators to encourage their principals to verify their accounts, because anyone can really open an account on Minister Sisulu's name, right? But when there's misinformation or when there's disinformation and there are two accounts, right? Which one do I trust? That blue verification tick becomes that most important badge that helps me to determine which account to trust. So, Ndate Sibeko, I'd like to stop here. If there was anything that I wish we could move into with regards to at least seeing when we put out this report in the new year, is that the leadership must do better. the skills and capacity gap in terms of managing social media and digital communication platforms should be considered more to be more strategic communications function, and a lot more of experimentation and innovation. A lot of the companies that do well as far as digital communications is concerned is when they innovate. And lastly, is on investment. We need a lot more resources committed to making sure that there is capacity in the offices of the respective premiers, respective MECs, and the respective ministers as far as digital communications is concerned. Thank you so much, Ntate Sibeko.
Wow, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I can say for now. Quite an extensive report that has come out from this study, and I think we really deserve a round of applause, Lorato, for the amount of work that you've put in. Very, very informative, and very important for us to know, especially in the population and communication management space, where we are concerned about communication, where we want to see credible communication going out. This report is important because it positions us favorably and allow us to be relevant in application of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So it is evident, ladies and gentlemen, that Twitter is indeed a force to be reckoned with, and Twitter provides an unmatched way to connect with and directly speak to public officials and the representatives. Now, I would like to invite Madam Tessa Dooms, our political analyst, to respond. But before she does that, just tell us which institution she's with. But as she responds, here's a question for you, Madam. And the question is that Twitter is the most news-friendly social media platforms, and it is by far the place that journalists are most likely to spend their social media energies. Okay, what is your take on this? Okay, over to you, ma'am.
All right, thank you everyone for your time and this invitation to speak amongst communicators. Lorato gives me way more credit than I'm due in terms of the label of a communicator. I really moonlight as a communicator from time to time, although the organization that I do represent, which is Just Sorrow Consulting, does have a communications arm to it. So we do three things in the development communication space. We do strategy development for organizations, we do research and insights gathering, and we also do communications, but I'm not the communicator at Just Sorrow. I have a partner who is much more tuned to that. But really the reason why I think this is a really good conversation for me is that it brings together two worlds that I've been a part of. One is the space around politics and looking at politics. As a communicator of politics, as a political analyst, I get to talk about the things that I see. And so I pay a lot of attention to what politicians and government officials are doing on particularly a place and a platform like Twitter, but also in other communications spaces. But also the other part of what my input will be based on today is, as Lorato pointed out, work that I've done in the COVID communication space for an organization called COVID Comms, which is an organization that started off as a volunteer communications platform where at this point over 100 communicators in different disciplines and art forms have come together and done work to simplify COVID communications over the last few years, 2 years now almost. And it's now turned into a social enterprise, really, that's committed to not only work in the COVID space around communicating ideas that are deeply political, deeply policy oriented and social, but now branching out into other sectors as well. And so those are the two hats and the two reasons why I'm here. So to answer the question, I was actually going to start with this. What do I think about Twitter as a space for political engagement and engagement with policymakers? The fun story is that's why I joined Twitter. So I've been on Twitter since 2009 or so. And my first year or two joining Twitter, I was inactive. I was an egg. I didn't know what was going on. And the day that I actually started using Twitter actively was in 2011, when the DA marched in the CBD. Musi Mamane led his first march in the CBD. And that was all happening on Twitter. There was nowhere else you could actually follow live what was happening with that march than Twitter. And so I think I got kind of swept up into that and started to make an intentional effort about curating Twitter to be a place where I could get political content. And it's grown. My interest in politics, I think, has definitely grown because of my use of Twitter in that very specific way. But I also make a joke to young people in the social science that much of the money that I've made as a political commentator, not just, and I assure you, actually, most of it is not what you see on television, but in terms of work that comes through and people who see your views and see your insights, and organizations that I've engaged with, has come through Twitter. So I found it to be a really useful place for many reasons. And I think it's an important place for politicians, not because it's where the majority of South Africans are. I think that there are two other platforms, particularly right now, that politicians need to be thinking quite seriously about, which is Facebook and WhatsApp. In terms of a mass reach of people in the country, given our data concerns and constraints, and given people's connectivity challenges. So if you wanted to reach the majority of people in the country, I would be asking, what are you doing on Facebook and on WhatsApp? But when it comes to, rightfully so, a captive audience of people who are coming and intentionally looking for news on current affairs and politics, you do have almost 10 million people on Twitter, give or take a few bot accounts, that are there and are interested in engagement. We need to remember what Twitter was initially designed for, and the reason why, as political actors, they need to be engaged, is that Twitter was designed initially as a business-to-business platform. So in the early days, Jack would talk about it in those senses that it's supposed to be a place where two businesses or two business entities, even if they're individuals, had a quick place where they could connect and exchange ideas and build communities that are not only geographic, but are around issues, themes, debates, and so forth. And in that sense, the most important actors on social media platforms need to be those who see themselves as either individual brands or representing brands. Because as Twitter has evolved, it's now become a premier place where you can interact not with another person per se, but with a brand. As an individual in the world who has no brand, I come to Twitter because I see that as a place where brands are active and personified, and I can engage with them. What political actors need to know and think about is that when they get onto Twitter, they are a brand. They are not just representing an organization or an institution, they themselves are a brand that they need to manage, and then there's an institutional brand. And I think part of where the wins and losers are in those lists, when you look at the ways in which ministers and other political and government officials interact, the people who do the best, and I'm going to give a definition of what I think best is as we continue, but the people who do the best are the people who have that balance, who understand when they log onto Twitter as an individual, they have to keep in balance the fact that they are a brand that they are managing, and that they are then using and leveraging their own brand to represent an institution. I think people who do it the other way around, who come onto Twitter as an individual and assume because they have an institutional representation, or they represent an institution, that they are only about the institution and that's the only thing that they represent, and that the institution gives them credibility. I think that's the wrong way to think about what's happening on Twitter. I think you need to say to yourself, I am a brand, and I then carry and I leverage my brand for the institutions I serve. It's influencers 101. That's what influencers know. The thing that they get paid, I'm now finding out, hundreds of thousands of rands to do is to not leverage the brand of the company, but to leverage their own brand in favor of the company. Which is why what Lorato said about the ways in which politicians are using it, and not, especially when people become spokespeople, when you stop engaging it as an individual, and you start being very overly cautious and tentative about engaging it as an individual, you're going to lose traction. You're going to lose people, because people are actually saying to themselves that this is an inauthentic account. So I'm going to talk through 3 things that I think are important for all government people and then all government accounts to think about when they're engaging on Twitter particularly, but in social media generally. Then we're going to talk about a bit of a case study and the point I want to make about followers and content. And then I'll just talk about, I think, the top 5 things I've learned about it in terms of COVID really quickly. The 3 things that I think are important for everybody to have are authenticity. So to be honest and relatable is absolutely important. People can tell when you're not being yourself, when you're, especially in the age of social media. There's an opportunity for people to give an account regularly of what their work is. So one of the things that's worked well for the presidency in this regard is the weekly newsletter, which is something that is an ongoing account of the president's work. But something, as Lorato pointed out, that the president hasn't done very well on social media or in regular news is being willing to account to the public and answer questions about ongoing work, as opposed to very niche opportunities in a time of crisis for the president to speak. And so I think accountability needs to not only be honest, but it also, and ongoing, it needs to be bi-directional. And then the last thing is attention capital. And the thing that you need to think about is what will bring people's attention and keep people's attention. And not only the numbers of people, but the quality of those interactions. One of the things we've learned about social media is that you can have high numbers of followers, but very low quality of content. And that doesn't really bode very well for your ability to provide messaging. So reach is nice. You can say so many people saw it. But unless you know that as an account and as a brand, people actually want to see what you have to say about an issue, you're not going to have their attention. You will have the follow, but you won't necessarily have the attention. And let's think about this in terms of a very well-known public figure who used to use Twitter, which is Donald Trump. Donald Trump got attention capital through being outrageous. He was often outrageous and had a high volume of content, this kind of stream of consciousness that he became known for. And people wanted to see what outrageous thing would Donald Trump say today. And that got him a large following. And I think that that was what he really wanted. He wanted a following because of the way his personality set up, but also he saw that as valuable for his political ambitions. But what he didn't have a lot of was quality engagement with content. And the lesson for me in understanding Donald Trump and the ways in which he was successful in terms of Twitter is that following is fickle, but content is king, and quality content is king. You really, as we know as communicators, communication isn't about getting the message out. It's also about somebody receiving the message. And the way you know they've received a message is that they speak back to you and they then carry that message forward. If all people have is you giving them content, you giving them messaging, you cannot actually show that you have a share in their attention capital. And I think content is a better way to get that share than just being outrageous or just having a high volume of things to say. The quality of content absolutely matters. And then the last thing I wanted to share was just some of the lessons we learned about COVID, or about communications through COVID and COVID-19. And here there are just 6 small things to say. The way COVID Comms went about its work that I think has filled some gaps that there've been in the space around COVID is by being simple. We focused on simple, plain language. And so we always brought out content in the simplest forms. And we've seen government take the same tact with the infographics that come out as short and sharp, simple language for explaining complex scientific things. But the second step is also multi-language. And I think we've got a gap in our communications around multi-language. We need to get to the point where all 11 languages are serviced by important information, particularly information that's coming from government at a time of crisis. The second is to communicate the facts that you know and communicate when you don't know facts. We are often shying away from saying, I actually don't know the answer to this. The information is not available yet. We'll know more in future. COVID has taught us the importance of being able to say that and being honest about not only what we know, but also what we don't know. The next is about responsive listening. And this goes to the point of not only saying what it is that you want to say, but responding to what others say. If you go onto Twitter as a brand, whether it's an individual or a company, people want to know that you're not only there to talk, but you're also there to listen. And so the skill of using Twitter and other social media platforms for social listening and then engaging back is really important. And I think somebody like Panyaza Lesufi does that really well. He actively engages in social listening, which I think has bode him really well. And then the last two things are around just some human elements. One is about relatability, which is linked to this idea of being authentic. But the other is more important, which is trust and empathy. And I think Lorato pointed out to one of the ideas around Fikile Mbalula as a minister, getting a following because of being abrasive, not necessarily because he's being inviting and caring. And I think there's an element of trust and empathy that people want to see, an element of humanity they want to see when engaging with public officials. And because Twitter is one of those places where it feels like you're having a one-on-one conversation, it's really important to communicate with trust and empathy in mind. So I'll leave my inputs there for the moment and give Crispin an opportunity since we've lost so much time already.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that valuable information. You've touched on something very, very important on your 3 points on authenticity, accountability, and attention. But what stood out for me in your presentation is the issue of a brand. Because when we communicate, especially on the social media platforms, there is a brand. The minister is not just speaking as a minister, but he carries that brand for that particular ministry that he's representing. Now we have with us Kristen Phiri, who is a seasoned communication specialist. And congratulations, Kristen. I was watching your interview yesterday on one of the TV channels. You came across very strong and you really spoke your mind and very calm, cool, collected. Now, Twitter remains the most influential platform used as a channel for news and prompt information sharing by politicians or government leaders. So in your space, you put on the spot because you're a communicator, you represent an organization, and at the same time, there may be other challenges that whatever you may be communicating may change the narrative. The narrative may be changed by the minister himself that you are representing. What is your take on this topic today? And what are the challenges that you go through on Twitter, and how often do you use Twitter? Over to you, Crispin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sibeko, and to Lorato, the team, for inviting me. I think I wouldn't consider myself at all a seasoned communicator. I think that's the many more others that we continue to learn from in the environment, and there's always opportunity to learn. Also, thanks to Tessa for her remarks. I think they were quite insightful, a lot of which I probably agree with. I won't specify which parts, but I think I just want to say this. What we just saw on this platform now is actually, to some extent, an accurate representation of what actually happens on Twitter. So at one point, you would be wanting to have a conversation, and then suddenly someone comes and tries to sell you Bitcoin, and meanwhile, we're talking about how COVID-19 spreads in courts. So I think that's one of the major problems with Twitter actually is its own authenticity and its inability to really authenticate some of the participants that actually participate on Twitter. So I think I'll just touch maybe on 3 topics. That's Twitter as a space for engagement, and then overall how COVID has transformed the way we structure engagements. And then lastly, I'll also look at maybe what should be the standard for how we communicate on Twitter. I think, yeah, as I've just said, Twitter from where I sit is actually a very interesting space in that, like Lorato has just pointed out, Lorato had pointed out that it is a site where it's very newsworthy, and the number of things that we are able to put out do come across as news, and they're engaged by literally anyone who has a platform or the ability to go onto social media. So as in the past where there was this barrier between the public and government, now we don't have such a barrier anymore. The government can directly interact, or a government official can directly interact with a citizen sitting somewhere in Matatiele within 5 minutes. Whereas in the past, and I think most of us who have seen government comms for the longest of times would remember that in the past, you literally have to go to Matatiele and conduct imbizo there. That's how you would engage with that community, and they would then explain to you what the issues are in that community. But now with the advent of technology and social media, political principles can be reached at any time of the night. Government officials can be reached at any time of the day. Literally tag someone with a question and ultimately hope that they will be more responsive. And I think that's where, on the whole, as government communicators, that's something that we can improve on. I think being a lot more responsive. But that's a point that I'll touch on as I conclude. The second issue that I do want to point out, and I think the report is, I think, a very good start for us to have an engagement around how effective our communications are. So kudos to the team for producing such a comprehensive report. But the interesting thing for me that I think is lacking in the report, and maybe I see with the next iteration, I hope it's something that the team will consider, is actually looking at the number of MPs who are on Twitter and their level of engagement. And this is, and of course, there are probably 480 of them across all political parties, or in the region of 400. So it might be a mammoth task. But this is important because ultimately, in a proportional representation system, that's really where the biggest level of political engagement actually takes place, and is in Parliament. And if you look at other jurisdictions like the US, also places like the UK, you do see a high level of engagement from, say, a shadow minister of Labour on Twitter versus a senator as well in the US. People are not necessarily in the executive, but they have a prominent social media presence, and they're able to take up policy positions and policy engagements in their own right. And that way citizens are able to engage with lawmakers directly. I think that's something that we also need to consider looking at, because what we want to ensure as well as citizens is that the policymakers that we have elected, albeit through a proportional representation system, are held accountable or directly engage with us on some of the policy propositions that they put forward in Parliament. And a classic example now, for instance, was with the Section 25 amendment, or rather the 18th amendment of the Constitution, where we were looking to propose a constitutional amendment. And what we see there is we don't see an engagement really on the two different policy propositions from the different parties. We see it being reduced to personalities, and that's the level of engagement that we see on Twitter. But I think as we go forward, I think that's something that as South Africans, we must probably evolve into. But at the moment now, I think as a government communicator, I speak for myself, really. I think I use Twitter as a platform to put out information. And I'm very selective on who I would choose to engage with, because the type of people that we find on Twitter, generally we don't find people who are conducive to having a rational discussion. There are far and very few in between. And when we do come across those, and then we must try and engage that as much as possible. What we have also done in the Ministry of Justice is actually we've created a completely separate account that that speaks for the ministry, or that interacts with ministerial content. So we would have the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development account. DCS, Department of Correctional Services, currently don't have an account on Twitter, but it's something that the department is looking at implementing. Then we have a ministerial account, which really covers broadly the policy positions, mostly of the ministry and the minister, and as well as the 2 deputy ministers and their engagements. And we think that's important because what you also want to illustrate is that you have a department which has an accounting authority, and they would be responsible for certain activities which are mainly administrative in nature. But policy positions need to be clearly articulated by the executive authority, which would be the minister. But also, if you want to engage the ministry, you should be able to do so without necessarily engaging a Crispin or engaging Ronald Lamola, Minister Ronald Lamola, in their personal capacity. We should be able not to personalize these individuals, because tomorrow a Crispin could be at Kokta, and you want to still to be able to engage the ministry in the same way as when Crispin was there. So that form of institutionalization is something that we have introduced, and we're looking at how it's going. And I think that's where you would have seen that that Ministerial of Justice and Correctional Services account has grown quite significantly, and I think quite steadily. And the interesting thing about the Ministry of Justice and Correctional Services is that it's actually 2 separate departments. And so we want to create that distinction to say there's a minister that's accountable for both departments, but it's not necessarily one department. And I think that's something that we still struggle with. A lot of people still refer to us as the Department of Justice and Correctional Services, whereas it's 2 separate departments. And we're not at a point yet of discussing whether we are going to integrate the 2 departments and into one single department. I think a lot of studies are still being done around that to see whether we can integrate the 2. And we've seen, for instance, in the UK, they now have a single Department of Justice and Correctional Services in one. But that would require a lot of organizational work, a lot of streamlining of various policies, literally probably considering changing the accounting officer structure. And given the fact that we have over 248 correctional centers, over 146 regions with courts, it would make the Department of Justice a very, very cumbersome department to manage. But these are things that we are looking at. And so also when engaging on platforms like social media, I think the ability to draw that distinction to say, yes, it's one political principle, but there are 2 separate accounting offices and 2 separate departments in the system that deal with these queries is something that we have to navigate. We now no longer actually have imbizos. We have direct access to political principles. And I think the critique there can still be that not everyone is on social media, not everyone is on Twitter, so we still need to have those physical engagements in communities. But by and large, I think if you are saying that over 9 million citizens are on a particular platform, it really does speak to our ability to reach citizens quickly with their queries, with their issues, but also to engage them quickly on what government is doing. But also we've seen, even the way we conduct media engagements, a platform like this, for instance, has enabled society to now engage, or the media particularly to engage through this platform. So using Zoom and linking that into YouTube, we can now have press conferences, also where citizens are also on board. And that has changed communication quite significantly. It has really streamlined the way we used to conduct our press conferences. So previously you would have to put out an advisory and people would come physically. And to some extent, the notice time would have to be at least 2 days in advance so that people can prepare to come and drive up to Pretoria where the seat of government is. But now that has all changed. We can literally have a press conference in the next half an hour, and people can join in online wherever they are. As we've seen with the family meetings, I think one of the most significant things about the family meetings is people actually no longer watch them on TV per se. So the number of engagements that you actually see what we call family meetings now with the president giving an update via Facebook or via Twitter is huge. And those were numbers that ordinarily would have been on TV, but also you'd no longer have to be in South Africa to understand what's happening in the South African space. And that's the beauty that social media has really given us. So you could be the ambassador of Jamaica for South Africa, and you could know exactly what the president has said in real time because of the advent of social media as well as Twitter. So what we're looking at as well, broadly, I think, at least in this department, is the capacity to have really, really good streaming capacity and capabilities. I think that's really becoming more and more important as we engage in communications through the social media advents. And it's something that overall is a determining factor in whether our engagements are of good quality or not. Because if we have an engagement where the internet is of poor quality and we cannot hear what the other interlocutor is saying, that reduces the quality of engagement overall. I had mentioned the fact that social media has really broken down the barriers between not only the media being an intermediary for citizens, but citizens themselves can now directly engage with political principles. But the interesting thing, Chair, that I think we must have a conversation about is this interface between the personality and the brand. And I see Minister Fikile Mbalula has been cited as an example of him being constantly in tours and how that is perhaps seen as unministerial. And I think it's an interesting dichotomy, because you do want to know that you are interacting directly with the minister, and those who have known the minister know that he is someone who doesn't pull punches. He's someone who engages in what is being given to him, and if you come a certain way, he'll also interact a certain way. It may appear to some it may appear as unprofessional. To some it may appear as unministerial. But one thing you do know is that that is the minister, that is his personality. And it also speaks to us as spokespersons as well. Like Lorato had just said in the beginning, I joined Twitter not as a spokesperson, I joined Twitter as Crispin, probably as an egg at first, and then eventually constantly engaged on the platform and still do engage on the platform as Crispin. And I think we should be allowed that leeway to comment on what we think is funny content sometimes, without it being, oh, is this the Department of Justice's position on X? Which is what we see a lot as government spokespersons. And I think the net effect of that is then the withdrawal that you would see, because you don't want to just be one-dimensional. Everything that you put out is simply about the Department of Justice. That's not who you are. You are Crispin Phiri on Twitter as well. And so that dichotomy is something that I think we're still learning, and is a line that we're still trying to straddle quite carefully. And I think, even in government communication platforms, these are some of the things that we're looking at. And I know for a fact that there is a social media policy that is being put out by the GCIS to really look at how we all interface on Twitter and what becomes the role of government communicators on Twitter vis-a-vis it being also a personal micro-blogging site. Because for me personally, that's what Twitter was. It would be a place where I used to just go and speak my own musings and speak to myself virtually. But now it's a little bit more different. The last thing I do want to touch on is what should be the standard in light of what I've just said. How do we interface on Twitter? And I don't know if we recall, but I think the city of Johannesburg used to have this brilliant responsive team. And I think they always used to sign off the account or the tweet as TK. And you would have a pothole somewhere there in Bryanston is this big, and someone would take a picture, and then someone from COJ would come back and tweet to say, it will be fixed within 24 hours, the team is on it, sign off TK. I think that should be the standard. We should be able to be at the forefront of what people's concerns are. If they are authentic and they are legitimate, government platforms should be able to be that level of responsive. almost like the Nando standard as well, where we're able to also engage on these platforms as much as possible, but in an accessible manner. And I think that's what used to make the Nando's brand a success. Of course, we now know that they support racists. Also equally responsive, but like Tessa had also highlighted, the quality of that engagement was constantly, I think, regrettable. And I think that's definitely what we don't want to see on social media is someone at the level of the head of state engaging in the manner that that individual did, I think is a cause for concern. And so when we also say that we don't want the presidency, for instance, to be a one-way street of just constantly pumping out information, I think what we also definitely don't want is a Donald Trump style type of an engagement. And I think those are things that we should be mindful of. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts broadly, Chair, loosely formulated. I'm happy to take questions and also engage further on some of the things that I have said and clarify any position that someone may deem problematic. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Puri. Before I open the platform up for questions, let me extend a special word of welcome to a very special guest of ours, Dr. Lucky Mlilo, all the way from Zimbabwe, Bulawayo, and our special sister and a communicator, Madame Kusela Diko. Welcome, Mama Sisi. It's good to have you with us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to open up for questions and answers. May I, before I do that, we were supposed to finish at 15:30, but we were disturbed somehow by the hohos that jumped in during our conversation. May I ask that we perhaps extend to 15:45, another 10 minutes, to allow for question and answers? Are we all okay with that? Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. Before I open the floor up for Madam Moramaholo, there's a follow-up question. We often say you've got to strike the iron while it's hot. For Crispin, Baba, in your honest opinion, what currently lacks when it comes to interrelation between government communication and social media?
What currently lacks between?
When it comes to interrelation between government communication and social media?
I think, I think there are two things that lack. And I think this is one of the things that definitely GCIS should look into. The ability to drive content, for instance, from our websites into social media so that people are constantly engaging with authentic, credible information, I think is something that is not deliberate enough. And then, of course, like I've said, the lack of engagement is something of a concern. So we're not seeing responsiveness from a lot of accounts that are there on social media. But that's also given, I think, given the fact that the level of engagement, for instance, if you follow the government ZA account, they put out a lot of critical information there, and it's got a very good following. But the responses in return by maybe citizens or people who are out there, I think they demoralize one from really engaging. So there's that dichotomy of engaging on the one hand and putting out information, but also the ability to use social media as a driver to ensure that the content that's on a lot of government websites, all of the information that we have on our government websites, annual reports, for instance, actually finds expression on platforms like Twitter so that people are able to engage on that information that is out there. A lot of government information is out there. If you want to know the number of a station commander in Mamelodi, it's there. It's on the departmental website. You know, we don't have to necessarily tag a minister for that. We can actually hold that station commander directly accountable on a platform like social media. So that ability for me is what's lacking, and I hope that we can really improve on it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Before I also open the platform for for participants to ask a question, just to help you warm up, Tessa. Question for you: do you think the media played a key and responsible role since the outbreak of the pandemic, more in relation to how Twitter is used as a platform for misinformation?
Yeah, I think the media played an important role, particularly in giving government space to engage with the public and speak on a regular basis in ways that I think was necessary. Where I think the media fell short is that the media was, again, working with one-directional communication strategies. So just being a conduit of information coming from government or scientists, but not necessarily creating enough opportunities for people to respond or interact with government, with scientists. I think we've seen it getting progressively better over the course of the pandemic, and also with the advent of things like spaces, for example. There's a little bit more room for the public to talk back and to engage back. And I would have wanted to see, for example, a lot more requesting and eliciting of public thoughts and comments and responses and stories from the side of the media that could be engaged and shared on social media, shared and even on traditional news platforms, rather than only focusing on the one directional. Because in regards to the question about misinformation has been allowed to brew in a context where people have felt that their questions have not necessarily been answered. So they then go and look for their own answers in less credible platforms, because they're not always getting a platform where they can ask a question and get it answered from more reliable sources.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to take two questions from the participants live. Moremogolo Leroke and Mongezi Mtati. Please just briefly introduce yourself and get straight to the question.
Thank you, leadership. I'm going to
Moremogolo?
get straight. Thank you, leadership. I'm going to get straight to the point. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much for what a beautiful, beautiful presentations. All of them were awesome. I have questions, and some of them are directed to the specific persons who were presenting. Thank you so much, all of you, for a brilliant presentation. I'm Moremogolo. I'm a global transformation strategist with Global Transformation University in Tokyo, Japan, and also a lecturer at Northwest University. I like to use a social media platform, especially Facebook. Questions. And when I think the question is related to, I'm a member of the academia, I teach in this area. One of the questions, when I ask the question, I'll say to who the question is. Question one, to Ntate Tsenking, what a beautiful presentation. Ntate Tsenking, what can you say about regulation of social media in South Africa? You can take that down. What can you say about the regulation of social media in South Africa? Tessa Dooms, what role do the hashtags play? What role are hashtags playing in today's social media platforms and in South Africa by extension? Mr. Phiri, government communication platforms. Ntate Phiri, I'm glad that you're a government communicator. I want you to tell us, what does the government policy say about social media? And how effective is that? And is it in full use? I know it was signed by government, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. What does it say? Tessa Dooms, another question to you. What were the key learnings on the use of social media platforms during the COVID pandemic? I have in mind here misinformation, disinformation. This is for Tessa Dooms. What were the key learnings? And I'm glad that you are a woman and very pretty, but that you are also consultants in this area. What were the key learnings about usage of SMPs or social media platforms, especially during COVID, with reference to disinformation and misinformation? Another question to you, Tessa Dooms, is what can you say now with the fact that these platforms are here and have arrived? What can you say about online journalism and citizen journalism with that background? A question to Ntate Tsenking. You talked about using social media and the government, and I was listening to you, and I'm saying, what is the cost? Ntate Tsenking, what a brilliant presentation you gave. What is the cost of social media usage in government? And not so long ago, I was presenting to the government treasury, and I learned that $500,000 a month is used by government employees. I also learned from the IT Director General that this usage is not work related. In other words, people are at work using the free internet, which is actually not free because our tax money is paying for it. People are actually online and offline. Yeah, they are really online, but really offline because they get the free internet from GIS. But when they go on, they're looking for Lucerne, how to prepare spaghetti, how to do your eyebrows on point, etc. What is the cost, and what can we say about that? Another question is what?
Okay. Sorry, Madam. May we just hold it right there? I've got two more hands, and we are really pressed for time. I have my leadership, Madam Kusela Diko and Chris Fleming. May I just ask the panelists to respond to your questions, Madam Remogolo? Maybe just respond for two of each questions, then we shoot straight to Madam Diko and Mr. Fleming.
Sorry, Chairperson. Thank you, Malik. Can I just send my email address and then I will send these questions to the specific persons? Can I just on the chat give my email address? Thank you, leadership.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Ray Checking, let's start with you. Hope
Thank
you
so much.
Note the questions.
Yes, I did. That is Bego. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to Memo Remkhulu. So one of the most important things about communication spaces is that we should never allow for a wild west kind of situation, right? And hence regulation is important. A lot more often we prefer self-regulation, depending on people's goodwill and our own will to always distinguish between good and bad and the likes. But like we've seen with people hijacking our platform, unfortunately, when this happens, there should be an independent arbiter that from time to time, when there's a complaint or some sort of requirement to deal with issues of bigotry in particular, whether it's racism, sexism, or any other where people are discriminated against, there is a way of that regulation. But secondly, and most importantly, what I think we should also ought to do is some sort of country regulation. Currently, a lot of the regulation happens from the platform point of view. For instance, Twitter has its own community management rules, right? Where if somebody does something wrong or makes an unsubstantiated claim, you report them to Twitter. And because Twitter, unlike in other markets, they do not have a presence where they are in tune with the laws and the nuances and dynamics in the country, it then makes them to be dealing with us with a very arm's length kind of approach. And I think that is lacking. So that may be something that we need to be thinking about, to say, how do we ensure that when Twitter responds, and one of the simplest examples or anecdotes is, remember with Google, for instance, they consider bare-breasted maidens as pornography, the images as pornography, right? Whereas in an African culture, that is not pornography. And that shows lacking nuance and understanding of what culture is. And I think that's the most important part there. With regards to cost, and I think it's something that we really need to look at from a quantifying point of view. In fact, in our first report that we had put out, one of the recommendations we had made was that just like there is a set aside on spending on community media, the same should be done for social media, right? Not only because, as Crispin has indicated, the ability of it to break barriers in terms of, removing the middleman, but also it is a lot more inexpensive to use social media to connect with a number of users. But the difficult question there is, where does that money go, right? Unlike if you were spending money on a community radio station, you know that money is being spent in South Africa, on a South African radio station, in South African skills, developing a young South African who's a community radio station. But when government spends much money on Facebook, unfortunately, that's all the money that goes offshore. So that's a different conversation to be had around. While we advocate for increasing the spend on social media, we should then be thinking a lot about how do we make sure that rand circulates to also improve the lives of South Africans in the main. Thank you so much, Ndadisbeko.
Thank you so much. May I ask Tessa to just also answer a question? Then we move over to Crispin. Then the second round will then take the questions. Right, Tessa?
Thank you. So hashtags are less important now than they used to be, I think, right at the beginning of Twitter, because I think the algorithms have gotten much smarter. And so as long as you have a very clear set of messaging and words that are going to come up consistently in the kind of messaging that you're doing, you're likely to be able to build up the ability to trend. But hashtags are really useful when you have a pre-existing set of people who are going to be tweeting about something at the same time, and you want to use that to kind of build up a hashtag that other people can catch on to very quickly. So hashtags are for efficiency in terms of communicating and building up a trend. But I do find that the algorithms are much smarter than they used to be in the ability to make something look like it's trending organically, but because you're using really smart messaging and very clear language, that it actually picks up by itself. But I still think hashtags are useful if you know how to use it before you start your communication opportunity or strategy. The lessons around misinformation from COVID, like I said, simplicity and language were a big part of what we thought was important in terms of the way we did COVID messaging. But I think the thing about misinformation that I learned is a lot of misinformation was going through channels of trust. And so when you look at Twitter, for example, in terms of how misinformation happens there, it's almost a confrontational situation between anti-vaxxers and vaxxers, and it becomes this big debate, where the majority of misinformation has really been going through on Facebook and WhatsApp platforms, where it's more about relationships that you already have of trust. You're there with your cousins and your uncles and your aunts and your grannies, and they are sending you very small bite sizes of information in video content or in audio content. And because the source that you're directly getting it from in that moment is probably a trusted source, misinformation lands easier. And so I think there was a battle between the small trusted misinformation that was happening and bigger content that was coming out from mainstream media and Twitter. And then the last question was about citizen journalism. I think there's amazing opportunities for good citizen journalism and people being able to curate ideas, content, and let it be seen by the public. But the thing we must avoid doing is having a situation where mainstream media, just without verifying, without thinking through, without any engagement, just takes something that a citizen says and reproduces it uncritically. I think we've seen way too much of that, and I think that is incredibly harmful to the practice.
All right. Thank you so much, Tessa, for responding to those questions so eloquently. Mr. Piri, there was a question also sent to you.
Yeah, but if I can just quickly opine on those two topics now that Tessa and Lorato had just touched on. Regulation of social media, I think, also speaks to some extent what Tessa has just touched on now, where we have seen how mainstream media can produce very unreliable information through social media or relying on social media. And then that now also raises another debate on how do we hold the media accountable when they tell us that X amount of babies exist somewhere and no one can ever really verify that. The other end of the scale is, what do we do when we see people using social media to literally instigate violence? And we've seen that. And we've seen that the government actually does have a tool now with the new Cybercrime Act to actually go pierce the veil behind the account and actually establish who is the justice system. But at the same time, there's a very, very very important constitutional trade-offs that take place in the discussion around regulating social media. The first is the trade-off between privacy and surveillance. What we don't want is to be surveilled by the government on social media. We do want to have ability to go about our lives without having the impression that our lives are being surveilled. But on the other end of the scale, we also don't want to be censored by government. We want to be able to have the freedom of expression, but not get the sense that we are being censored about what we say. So those are the tensions that the regulation of social media creates in the policy space and in the legal space. And I think it's something that we'll continue to navigate as citizens and also in the country. On the third question that I was asked, the question was around government social media policy. So government does have a policy. The last I checked, I think it was passed in 2011. So I think it's now 11 years old. But that's exponentially over the last 10 years. So through GCIS, that policy is being reviewed, but essentially but policy sets out, or it's a guideline that sets out the norms and standards for what government accounts should be looking like on social media platforms, the look and feel of what social media accounts of government should look like. So those are the type of things that it addresses. It's a 60-page document. I'm happy to share it on this platform for everyone to peruse. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Puri. I must thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You know, your patience is worth so much. We've got 8 minutes to go, but there's no way we could stop this without hearing from a lady that I referred to as my leadership. Madam Kusela Diko, I hope you have not lost your thought trail. Over to you, ma'am.
And Dadisbego, thank you so very, very much for the opportunity. And I must thank you and congratulate you as PRISA for hosting this very important dialogue. I haven't really been in the social media space for the last year or so, but I still find the conversations very, very fascinating. I just have a couple of points, which I think are questions and maybe some level of input that I wanted to make. And allow me to also just extend my congratulations to the panelists, all of whom I thought that were absolutely fantastic. The first one was around, I think, what Lorato had said right at the beginning, where he spoke on the issue that these are more quantitative rather than qualitative assessments. I'm raising that because it would have been very interesting to see what is the nature of the communication that comes from these, either the cabinet ministers or even the government communicators, because it's one thing to have, 500,000 followers, but what is it that you're communicating to them? But as I raise that, it also goes to my second point, which says that, when Tessa speaks, she speaks on the need for quality content as being king. Now, that works both ways. While we may decry a unidimensional type of approach in terms of communications where government is seen to be broadcasting, it's important to also know what it is that government gets back and is therefore able to communicate to. Now, there seems to be this expectation that the government accounts will always push out quality content and society must be able to engage with it. But the reality is not that. The reality is such that, I'll make a stupid example, but it is the one that's in my mind just from yesterday, when the president would have congratulated Dr. Moloi Motsepe for her ascension as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, not the Chancellor, sorry, as of the University of Cape Town. There were remarks that came back and said, don't you guys have a family WhatsApp group? Don't you think that those things should be discussed as a family? Now, this has become the norm in terms of how on Twitter specifically, and I know that we're not discussing social media broadly, but on Twitter specifically, it seems as if the race for likes is more important than engaging qualitatively and constructively with government on issues. Because as you put out such things, at the end of the day, all you want to see, is your likes, your retweets coming out because you've said something that somebody thinks is smart, but you're not engaging with the content of what government says. And as I say that, I also appreciate that there's a trust deficit or a social distance that exists between government and society, so that government is viewed with pessimism, and anything that government says, somebody must be looking for a way to poke the Mickey in it. But there's something that is lacking in terms of how we're able to communicate. And I think we should keep that in mind as and when we discuss our relationship between government and society. But the other issue that I wanted to raise, Mr. Sibeko, is that government is a system. Government is not Kusela, it's not Crispin, it's not IT who engage on social media, but it's a system. So while you would have Nando's who's able to be quick on the fly and give a response to an issue at a particular time, even the city of Johannesburg, it is not that national government, provincial government, local government, all of them would operate in the same way. It's a system that requires you, as you make a statement, you must have the ability to back it up. And I don't think that is understood in terms of how the expectation is on social media for our engagement. The last point that I want to raise, and by no means the only point, is just that I'm very cognizant of your time challenges. I want to speak to the issue of the role of journalists on Twitter. You have journalists who, when they speak on Twitter, while they know that if they write in their official publications or anything, they are constrained by the press code. That same press code does not seem to apply when they speak and opine on social media. So you are no longer engaging with people who are supposed to be objective and who are supposed to present news truthfully and objectively on a platform, but you are engaging with opinions. Now, while I don't support regulation, I think I stand with Crispin on this to say, yes, self-regulation would be the way to go, as we've seen with the Press Council, but it is an abomination that journalists can go onto social media, Twitter in particular, and they opine all sorts of things by all sorts of people, and we are not able to hold them to account, because that is also part of this fake news thing that we are trying to at all times to deal with, because one of the biggest challenges that we faced in government when I was still there was the fake news that was being spread, whether it was around COVID or anything else. And somebody can just say, oh, well, it was on social media and therefore you have no recourse. And I think that is one of the things that PRISA should really look at going into the future. Mr. Sibeko, you owe me a proper discussion where I can raise all of the issues that I want to raise. I've got a list here of about 10 things, but those are the ones that I thought I must just deposit into this conversation. But it's a brilliant platform, and I thank you, and I thank your panelists so much for engaging in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're truly blessed to have you in our midst, and thank you for the real worthwhile contribution that you've made. I think the panelists and Mr. Chenking has taken notes. I have taken lots of notes, and there will be a follow-up really indeed for us to talk about this going forward and in our plans for the new year. We've got 2 minutes. I would like to hand this 2 minutes to Kwasiame. He's had his hand up for a long time. Let me just find him. Babumtati Monges. You can pose your question, sir.
Thanks. Thank you very much, and well done to everybody, PRISA and the Decode team. Thanks to the panelists for the great inputs and questions. Well, I've got a number of questions, but I'll ask one and I'll pose the rest on Twitter, I suppose.
Okay.
So, and this is, again, I mean, to all the panelists in, their different positions. The one question really that I find is critical is that are you finding that leaders who are present themselves on Twitter also lead departments that happen to be as responsive on Twitter as well? And I'm basing this off of a couple of examples, like when the lights are out, the city of Joburg is quicker to respond than Eskom in an area where it's not run by a city, but it's run by Eskom. And I'm also seeing that in how poor Eskom is to respond, the Minister of Public Enterprises happens to not be on Twitter. So are you seeing a link between government leaders and ministers who are on Twitter and departments that are responsive on Twitter, seeing as the traditional call center is now being replaced in some aspects by social media and Twitter? That's really my question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mtati. Chris, I would have done injustice not to give you a chance. Sorry, man, I skipped you. I should have called you first. Chris Fleming, please, Baba, pose your question. Then the panelists will respond. And this will then, I'll give this now chance to Lorato to wrap up. Chris?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Chris Fleming, and I'm a PR consultant based in Eswatini. I just had two quick questions. The first one is for Lorato and Crispin, and it revolves around the area whether SAGov has a formal or informal platform for communication personnel in different departments to share best practices and address common challenges. And if so, how effective is it? The second one is for Tessa, and it's around the COVID response. And I'm looking at the future as we move forward. Tessa, what's your confidence level that communicators can overcome the prevailing narratives that lead to vaccine hesitancy? Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. You've been too kind.
Thank you, sir. Right, panelists, start with the lady, Tessa, while it's still fresh in your mind.
Sure. So I wanted to respond to some of the comments Kusela made, because I think they're
Right.
very important. I think that the question about government's ability to respond quickly, I don't think that that's, for me, as important, that there is some kind of response and that response is qualitative. And I think it's about the way you also curate the spaces for responsiveness. So one of the government officials for me and public representatives for me that has done that well, even well before it was fashionable to do it on Twitter, was Buti Manamela, and is Buti Manamela. And I think that his ability to figure out a way that he can control a space, and now it's literally he's using spaces every Friday, where he can then be responsive. If it's directing people to the department, whether it's directing them to himself personally, or on Twitter, he'll say something that will then allow for a response that won't be in the moment, but might lead somewhere down the line, or curate a space that says, okay, on this day, we're going to be having this conversation. This is what it's going to be about. It's going to be for this time frame. And that helps with getting a better quality of response, even from the public. So I think there are creative ways to get better quality and sift through better quality from the public. But I don't think it should be a reason not to have some level of interaction and engagement. So the learnings on that, I think, are going to always be necessary. In terms of Chris's question about the future and how we ensure we don't have the kind of mistrust that builds up, I will say that the first thing to do is to have government officials who are trusted. And I think ongoing accountability, like I said earlier on, builds trust. So you're not only talking about your work when you're in trouble, you're talking about your work on an ongoing basis and people are able to reflect on that work. And I think Crispin makes a really good point about having a person in the form of the politician or the person in government, but also having the corresponding institutional accounts all working together with each other and for each other to build trust, so that you're not leveraging only the brand of the individual, but you're leveraging a system that can work together. So you need to think about, what is the minister going to say on his account? What is the office going to say in its account? What is the institution going to say? How are they going to manage that? And how are we going to make sure that the trust is spread across and the reliance is spread across those things? So you're not just dependent on one person's credibility for trust, but government needs to be trusted in and of itself. And then the second part of that is spaces for conversation. And one of the things that I appreciated watching particularly the UK and other European countries in the way that they engaged with the COVID response was that there was always this opportunity for Q&A. And I know this has been a contentious issue, particularly around the president. But I do think that that had some level to which people felt, you're not just coming at us with information, you are actually willing to respond to difficult questions. And that's also a form of building trust. So I think there are opportunities to learn here all the time, and we just need to figure out what's possible, but also what is preferable.
Okay, thank you so much. Crispin, your take?
Unmute myself. Yeah, I think on the question of the link between, do we find that representatives who are public representatives who are on Twitter, then ultimately have departments that are more responsive. I think there's not enough data for us to have a conclusive finding on that, but I think anecdotally that does seem to be the case. And some of the anecdotes that you have suggested do point to such. But interestingly, I see someone from Premier Makura's office here. I think we don't see a lot of engagement maybe directly with provinces, for instance, but they are equally present on social media. But my experience, so anecdotally, has also been that you don't have like someone directly pointing to a province and say, can you respond to X, Y, Z? So I think it's literally how people also choose to engage with particular accounts, and that also determines the level of responsiveness. So I think that it's unlikely that you'd have an account that's there and it's completely unresponsiveness. It's a then also from time to time, GCIS do call what they call government communicators forums, where they're addressed by the Minister of Communications, but now I think it would be the Minister in the Presidency. They would then give an address, sort of set a line of the type of communication standard that they would like to see in government. And then discussions are held around how we can improve that. And I mean, some of the outputs of that have led to what we see now as a government communications policy, ensuring that in certain government departments really take communications as a priority. I think if you look across government, one of the sad things in the recent past that you would have seen is if there's someone that they wanted to offload, for instance, in the establishment, they would say, oh, well, maybe let's put him in communications, him or her in communications. If there was a budget that they needed to cut, it would be communications first. But that's seeming to turn the tide a bit. We are now seeing that because of the government communications policy, there's a set amount that is required to be set aside for government communications as a whole. And then also what we're seeing is through the Public Service Administration is a set structure of what the communications unit should look like in government, so that we don't have a situation where if we don't like Crispin and he's not doing the part, we'll say, let's offload him to communications so that he can maybe find his feet there. So those are the improvements that we are seeing, and we hope that they will also continue to bear fruit in the short and medium term. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Crispin. Just before I hand over to Lorato to wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very pleasant afternoon. You know, when you've got people sitting in a session that extends beyond the normal scheduled time, you must know it is quite interesting. It is good. It is hot in here. Before I hand over to you, Lorato, there's a comment by Ms. V, very valuable one. As you wrap up, please try and touch on it. Ms. V says, with the social media policy GCIS is working on, I really wish government will find a way of leveraging this platform to engage citizens meaningfully. Let's train government communicators to be effective in this space. It's not always an easy space to engage meaningfully, as we know. Mr. Chenking, your closing remarks, sir. And I see all the hands that are up. I'll take it. They are legacy hands. Over to you, Lorato.
Thank you so much, and to Crispin and Tessa, thank you so much for the invaluable input and insights. I think it shows that this is a conversation that ought to be had on a continuous basis, and perhaps we could segment it into a number of the sub-themes that really came out of the questions and the comments from the participants. And to everyone who attended, we are exceptionally grateful for your participation, the questions that you have sent. I think there are three key takeaways from this conversation that is there. The first takeaway is that, and this is a question that Crispin raised, to say, and I think it's something that we need to preoccupy ourselves with, is what is the standard, right? The social media policy functions as a framework, right? But in reality, we know that ordinarily there should be a way, and he uses the anecdote with the city of Joburg as an example to say, here's an example to emulate, right? And the biggest thing is now going to be if there's a consensus that city of Joburg, there was a time where they were doing social media exceptionally well, both from a capacity point of view, response point of view, delineation of roles, and in being responsive, innovation, and leadership in communication, but also taking responsibility and not hiding when there's a billing crisis or whatever the case may be. Are we now going to see a lot more government departments, local government, whether it's at a district or local or even at metro, moving towards that? And supplementing that question is to what Chris was asking, right? To say, is there an informal or formal community that is organized? And I know that Crispin responded to it about, the formal government communications forum that exists. I think that we need to be deliberate in organizing a community that focuses on social media, because it's a domain by itself, right? Just like people who are media liaison specialists who deal with media relations, in particular media engagement, we ought to be thinking that way with regards to the digital communications. Who should lead that? In my view, government should always be taking the lead, because one, they have the institutional capacity to do that. Two, they also have the ability to mobilize the army of government communicators to be able to be responsive as and when it is required. The third one, which is another takeaway, is what Khusela raised around, reminding us that government is a system, right? That should be a no-brainer that happens. But we know that even without take social media away, any communicator depends on line functions to be able to provide them with information. And that is why the importance in that on our part we place on leadership, because even if there was no social media and there was no agility in responding to whether it's a media query, a crisis, or whatever the case, the leadership must then be at the heart of helping us to make some of the decisions quicker. But also, because imagine if the accounting officer, one has bought into the importance of being responsive, right? It then means that if communications as a unit that is a support unit is struggling with some functionary, they are able to quickly go to the DG and say, DG, there's this information that we need to be putting out there. It has implications of creating an unnecessary crisis. So she's able to, or he's able to crack the whip quickly, get the information, and be able to mobilize and make sure that the information comes across. The last one, Ntatesbego, if we had the wherewithal, we would have definitely had wanted to make this report a lot more better in terms of it being qualitative as well, because we know that quality is where things stand and not more in quantity, right? We are hoping to crack and through the relationships with some of the people in this team, through GCIS and other academic institutions, find a way of getting more researchers using technology as well, so that we are able to not only even make it an annual thing, but imagine if in March when we celebrate or when we mark the milestone of 2 years since lockdown, right? We do a thorough report that looks on how the respective health ministries and departments in provinces have done in different subjects, whether it was vaccine program, vaccine, messaging, or whatever the case may be. But we just isolate health as a separate entity and say, how well are they doing from communications? What were some of the gaps? Where could they be doing better? And how do we then help in making sure that this community of health communicators, are enabled and strengthened and supported to do it better. We hope to do it better next time again, Dr. Sibeko, and thank you once again to everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Chakeng. A very well spent afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, much appreciate you for being here as we close, and this being the last engagement for the year on the webinar. We wish you a safe festive season. We wish you to stay home, and if you will be traveling, please ensure that you are safe at all times. You observe all the safety protocols, you sanitize, you keep your social distance. Rather than worrying with the distance, rather keep a safe social distance at home with family rather than gallivanting. And to those of you that have not taken a jab, please do so. It's a good thing to do. If you can convince your friends and family to do that, let it be so. On behalf of the Public Relations Institute of Southern Africa, PRISA, we'd like to thank you, Chakeng, and thanks to you and Decode Communication. We wish you everything of the best and good luck on your future endeavors. And we look forward to more engagement next year. And to Madame Kusela, definitely I will touch base with you. We've got a lot more to talk about. To Crispin and Tessa, you are great. You were great, very impressed, and we thank you for your time. May the good Almighty keep you safe in his loving care and protect you at all times. Goodbye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Long live the chair.
Long live my leadership. And I forgot to acknowledge my chairpersons from Limpopo province and Namibia. Madam Ailey, thank you so much for making time.
Thank you all the presenters. Thank you, leadership, for good sharing. Goodbye. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. I've got another webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you. Good luck.
Bye.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye, Cleopatra. Babe Fleming. Siyabonga Nugget.
Thank you, Bongatsini, Chair.
Siyabonga Babe. Fanele Sente Eswatini. We owe Eswatini a lot of engagements. We'll talk after this. I'll catch you offline.
Most definitely, looking forward to it.
All right. Memo Sidi Mokhele, thank you so much for your time. Madam Chair Ailey Sangula Polini from Namibia, thank you for attending the session.